Remember, for inverses, again, the inverse of the original gives us x, or the original, if we plug in the inverse, again gives us x. So what if we have the inverse of sine of x? Or what if we plug the inverse sine of x into our original? Of course, that's going to equal x. Same idea then with cosine. If we take the inverse cosine of the original, or if we plug in, cosine, inverse cosine in there, again it equals x. So for example, if we have the cosine of inverse cosine of 1/2, what's that going to be equal to? Well, the inverse cosine of 1/2, this is our angle that we're talking about, that's at pi over 3. Well, what's the cosine of pi over 3? It is 1/2. Now, one thing we want to make sure of when we're looking at this is that we find values that are on the unit circle. If we have something like the inverse cosine of 4, well, that's undefined. Remember that our values have to be in between -1 and 1. So there's no way for a value to be greater than 1 on the unit circle. So here we're given f of x is equal to 5 times the sine of x plus 2 and asked to find the inverse of this function. Remember, if we're going to find the inverse, we have 3 steps to follow here. First, we want to rewrite this as y equals. So we have y equals 5 times the sine of x plus 2. And then we want to switch our x's and our y's. So we're going to say x is equal to 5 times the sine of y plus 2. And now last step is we're going to solve for y. So we're just using inverse operations. We would first subtract the 2 over, so we have x minus 2 equals 5 times the sine of y. Now we're going to divide by 5. So we have x minus 2 over 5 is equal to the sine of y. And now we take the inverse of both sides. So we would have the inverse sine of x minus 2 over 5 equals y. Now we rewrite that. So we're saying that we have the inverse is, that's what we have right here, the inverse sine of x minus 2 over 5. Now we know that the domain of the inverse of sine is -1 to 1. So if we look at this value of x minus 2 over 5, and we know that it has to be in between -1 and 1 when we plug that in for the inverse of sine, then we can look at these values and say, well, what can we plug in for x that then when we take the inverse is still going to be in between -1 and 1. So now we plug this in here and we're going to solve the inequality for x. So first we multiply by 5. We have -5 is less than or equal to x minus 2. Less than or equal to 5, and then we're going to add 2 to both of these. So we have -3 here, less than or equal to x, less than or equal to 7. So now when we look at the domain of the inverse, and that's this value right here, domain of inverse is going to be from -3 to 7. Here we have another example. F of x is equal to the cosine of x plus 2 plus 1. So again, we want to rewrite y equals cosine of x plus 2 plus 1. Now we switch our x and our y. So x is equal to the cosine of y plus 2 plus 1. Now we're solving for y. So I'm going to subtract 1 from both sides. X minus 1 is equal to the cosine of y plus 2. Now we do the inverse cosine. So we have the inverse cosine of this quantity of x minus 1 equals y plus 2. Now we subtract the 2 over. So we have y is equal to inverse cosine of x minus 1 minus 2. And if we're going to find the domain of the inverse, we're looking at x minus 1. Again, we know that that x minus 1 value has to be in between negative 1 and 1. Add 1 to both sides. We end up with 0 less than or equal to x less than or equal to 2. So then the domain of this inverse goes from 0 to 2. On this problem, we're asked to find the exact solution. So what we're going to do is we're going to solve for x. Again, we're going to use inverse operations here. So our first step would be to divide by 3. So we have the inverse cosine of 2x is equal to 2 pi over 3. Now we can move that cosine over. So we have the cosine of 2 pi over 3. Well, we can find that value on our unit circle. Cosine of 2 pi over 3, that's equal to negative 1/2. So now we have 2x is equal to negative 1/2. I'm going to multiply both sides by the reciprocal. So multiply by 1/2 here. So that's gone. We have x is equal to, so negative 1/2 times 1/2 is equal to negative 1/4. So our exact solution on this is negative 1/4. Here's another example. 5 times the inverse sine of x minus 2 pi is equal to 2 times the inverse sine of x minus 3 pi. Again, the idea is we're going to solve for x. We want x on one side, everything else on the other. All right, so we could add 2 pi to both sides and subtract 2 times the inverse sine of x from both sides. So now this has gone from this side. Here's my equal sign, doing the same thing to both sides. So negative 3 pi plus 2 pi becomes negative 1 pi, or just negative pi. These are gone on this side. I moved it over here. 5 minus 2, that becomes 3 times the inverse sine of x. From here, we're going to divide by 3. So now we have the inverse sine of x is equal to negative pi over 3. Move that inverse sine over, so we have x is equal to the sine of negative pi over 3. And then we can find that value, find that x is equal to negative square root of 3 over 2. So that would be our exact solution.